Hi guys, and welcome back to the Redcoat History Podcast. We've got an absolute belter of an episode today. It's all about the terrible, bloody Battle of Talavera in 1809. But we're telling the story differently. We're using one of the classic Peninsular War novels, Bernard Cornwell's Sharpe's Eagle, to explore the battle. Myself and Marcus Cribb will be exploring which parts of the novel actually follow the history of the battle and which elements are completely unrealistic. I first discovered the Sharpe books as a young boy in the early 90s. I was inspired. As a working class lad myself with a hankering for a commission in the army, the books and the TV show ticked all of my boxes. I never did fulfil my dream of becoming an army officer, but my love for the Sharpe books never waned. I'm assuming that you've probably read one or two of them yourself, or seen something of the TV show. If not, I highly recommend them. Many of the episodes can actually be found on YouTube in their entirety, some of them. Just to give you a bit of background, Bernard Cornwell is a British former journalist who, after quitting his job with the BBC, started to write so that he could try and make money while living in the US without a green card. He'd always been a fan of the Hornblower series, set during the same period, but about the exploits of a Royal Navy officer. Cornwell decided he wanted to do something similar, but about the army. What followed is a series of 24 books about the exploits of our super tough, super handsome, up from the ranks rifles officer as he stabs, shoots and shags his way across Portugal, Spain, Belgium, India and South America. Brilliant stuff. So before we get started with the interview today, I just wanted to remind you that my new book is now available. You can get it from Amazon and from Apple Books. I think it's $3.99 at the minute. There's even a paperback version. If you've got a loved one who can't get enough Napoleonic military history for their Christmas present, you know what to get them. Just search for the Military History Geek's Guide to the Peninsular War and you'll find it. The final 3 chapters actually cover the battle we're discussing today, Talavera. I also want to quickly thank the designer of my new logo, Nick Turner. He's a fellow military history geek like us. If you're interested in hiring him for a logo or other design work, you can just visit his website, nickisadesigner.com. Okay, enough of my blathering. Let's get over to my good friend Marcus Cribb, at mcribbhistory if you're on Twitter. In case you don't know him, he's actually the manager of Apsley House, which was Wellington's old residence in London. And he's an all-round expert on all things Peninsular War. Be sure to look him up, he's a brilliant guy. So Marcus, surely you remember the first time you came across Richard Sharpe. Can you tell us about that? How did you get into his books or TV series?
I think I found them almost like simultaneously, kind of showing my relative age. I caught the last few on TV playing, I think they're on Friday, Saturday nights on ITV in the UK, and catching them. But it was right at the end of the series. I think it was Honour, Justice, Waterloo, and then waited a while, and then the Indian ones didn't come out for many years later. And in the in-between, I then went back and read the original series of books chronologically. I think even then Bernard Cornwell hadn't released the prequels of India with Tiger, Prey and Trafalgar. So I read them all through, and about the time that I finished that, along with Life in Between, the Indian episodes were going to be starting to come out, and the new books as well, with the prequels and the kind of crowbarred in episodes, which actually I really enjoy those books as well. So it's all kind of been a huge part of my growing up, and then a bit of a secret inspiration for my job and career as well.
Because haven't you've done some reenactment with the 95th, is that right?
Yeah, I'm relatively new to the reenactment world. Had one full year with a little bit of taster either ends as well. But yeah, I kind of shamelessly couldn't choose anyone else apart from 95th, though the guys and girls in red look really glorious, and we've got an attached artillery battery and rocket troop. I kind of wanted to go green. See what Baker Rifle feels like. You know, the smell of it, the weight of it. Is it short? Yeah, it is actually. And what's it like to fire with a shako on? Okay, it's actually really weird. So I can see why the cast threw their shakos away, and and they just wore the little floppy forage hats and things like that. You kind of get a bit of a good feel for it. It's nice.
Yeah, that's one. I've never had the opportunity to do any reenacting, but that's one thing I think I would love is just that inside knowledge of what it was like that you don't really get from reading books, you know. And I think that's really undervalued as a historian's tool.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, your books can conjure up amazing imagination, but the smells, the sounds are hard to add in. And on my first weekend, I was having a few shots of the baker and biting the cartridge. You can taste the black powder. And then I think we were wiped out after attacking a French column. We were exposed. And then the cavalry bared down on us. And I was having a sword fight using a baker rifle. And then afterwards lying down. And these horses, all of a sudden, it's terrifying. These big mustachioed guys who've grown their things that look like Azars, and they're coming at you with a sword. It really changes your perspective on the battle, definitely.
Brilliant. Well, I think because we've got a lot to get through today, let's crack on. And I wanted to look at our first introduction to Richard Sharpe, where we find him in the first book, Sharpe's Eagle, as a lieutenant commanding a group of riflemen during the spring of 1809. Now, I don't know if you recall, but his band had allegedly been left behind during the retreat to Corunna, and this is the first time we meet Lieutenant Richard Sharpe. Let me try and read from the book here. Lieutenant Richard Sharpe, waiting for orders in his billet on the outskirts of town, watched the cavalry sheathe their sabres as the last spectators were left behind, and then he turned back to the job of unwinding the dirty bandage from his thigh. As the last few inches peeled stickily away, some maggots dropped to the floor, and Sergeant Harper knelt to pick them up before looking at the wound. "Healed, sir. Beautiful." Sharpe grunted. The sabre cut had become 9 inches of puckered scar tissue, clean and pink against the darker skin. He picked off a last fat maggot and gave it to Harper to put safely away. "There, my beauty. Well fed you are." I won't do an Irish accent. Sergeant Harper closed the tin and looked up at Sharpe. "You are lucky, sir." That was true, thought Sharpe. The French hussar had nearly ended him, the man's blade halfway through a massive downstroke when Harper's rifle bullet had lifted him from the saddle, and the Frenchman's grimace, framed by the weird pigtails, had turned to sudden agony. So I'm going to skip forward there a little bit to ask you, Marcus. Are you aware, were maggots a sort of regular treatment for wounds in those days, or is there a bit of creative license there?
Medicine was really mixed. Maggots definitely were used. The other thing that they use quite commonly were leeches still, almost like medieval treatment.
I always think of Blackadder when I hear of leeches. You know the episode of Blackadder?
The leech farmer in Blackadder. And that's what I was thinking of. But it's really strange because you've got this mix of like development of technology with rifling inside a Baker rifle and rockets, but they're still using medieval functions. And there's even cases quite well recorded of officers being wounded, and they've got internal bleeding. And one of the treatments, they think they've got too much blood, so they'll do medical bleeding or apply leeches near the wound.
Oh, bleed me, damn you, Barton!
Which is obviously only going to weaken them further. So, but maggots, there is scientific evidence for it. You know, it's removing the dead skin and preventing that further infection. Every regiment would have had a surgeon, and in theory 2 assistant surgeons who would have been qualified doctors. So they weren't just being left to the likes of Sergeant Harper to apply themselves, but there would have been a certain amount of self-help when the regiment's 600 men strong and they've only got 1 to 3 doctors looking after them, especially some of the rifles were attached and detached. So yeah, they would have needed to pick up some old wise remedies kind of thing, yes.
Yeah, okay, well that's interesting, because a little known fact that I picked up on recently was that the casualty rate, or the death rate, should I say, among soldiers in the peninsula was actually very similar to the First World War, which a lot of people don't realise. And I think a lot of that was to do with to do with illness, wasn't it? You know, and common diseases that these days, you know, a soldier would be given some antibiotics and crack on, actually wiped out, you know, thousands of soldiers.
It was a mixture of the climate and the diseases and the lack of the immune system with them. And the medicine, yeah, at certain campaigns, it does change battle to campaign. Casualties could be as high out of the field as they were during a battle, especially with the added-on effect from wounds received. So, yeah, quite common that soldiers could be wounded on a march and die from a broken bone that they've fallen over from. and never mind just disease they've picked up from local food, local water. It was a really common procedure that I said the men weren't going to be with the regiment because they're wounded.
Yeah, no, crazy, really. So I think let's move on. So that was a sort of strange introduction to Sharpe, really, wasn't it? You know, it was kind of him having maggots picked out of his wounds. I thought was a counterintuitive way to introduce your hero. But here's
Star hero.
Yes, exactly. But it does get better. So the next time we see him, here's the description of Sharpe that Bernard Cornwell wrote. The Baker rifle was his mark. It set him aside from other officers, and 16-year-old ensigns, fresh in their bright new uniforms, looked warily at the tall black-haired lieutenant with the slung rifle and the scar, which, except when he smiled, gave his face a look of grim amusement. Some wondered if the stories were true, stories of Seringapatam and Asai, of Vimero and Lugo. But one glance from the apparently mocking eyes, or a sight of the worn grips on his weapons, stopped the wondering. Few new officers stopped to think of what the rifle really represented, of the fiercest struggle Sharpe had ever fought, the climb from the ranks into the officers' mess. Now that's a nicer intro, isn't it? That kind of draws you in and makes you think, oh, now this is a guy I could get behind.
The character.
What do you make of that? Would officers like Sharpe have been around? Is that a sort of common backstory you might have found back then?
Yeah, more common than we perceive. It's always perceived that the British officer was purely from the aristocracy, had purchased their way in, and they were really disconnected with their men. Not really the case. They are sharing a lot of the hardships of the campaign, first off. Aristocracy, yes, but when you start to look at the common pattern, the firstborn sons are staying at home because they're going to inherit the title a lot of the time. So it's going into the second and third sons anyway, who've got to go and make a name for themselves, like the Duke of Wellington himself. He was not the eldest son. And coming from the ranks was not completely unusual. It was not the majority. I believe, roughly speaking, in the rifles, it was about 1 in 10 men. And the rest of the army, it was about 1 in 20. So within a regiment, you are going to see some of these men. They might be looked down upon by certain officers of like the old school, but there is now, not just for the artillery and engineers who've been to military colleges like Woolwich, there is now Wickham, which is like a military academy closer to Sandhurst today. And so officers are training up as well as just purchasing in. So there's a bit of a mix. And something I came across in some of my research for this was what seems like a rare term, but it was about like 5% of men enlisted as a gentleman volunteer. So a gentleman volunteer joined the army hoping to become an officer, but couldn't afford it just then. They carried either a Baker rifle or a brown vest, they wore the uniform of a private soldier, and they were waiting for a commission to come available, generally when an officer was either killed, wounded, or promoted. And then they were going to purchase it at hopefully a good deal, almost like a mate's rates. They were going to get the best deal from their colonel, who'd allow the passing on officer to not have to sell it at such a high price. So they would actually mess with the officers in the evening, but work with the men during the day. So Bernard Cornwell portrays it's completely alien, but there would have been these men marching in the ranks, and they would have had, let's say, 1 or 2 men in the regiment who've come from the ranks either from daring deeds, storming breaches, or simply from purchasing it up themselves eventually, though commissions were really quite expensive, into 5 figures today in UK pounds. It would have happened eventually in some places. So they weren't the majority, but they would have been around, certainly.
Yeah, I think Cornwell's just used it for a bit of creative license to make his struggle even tougher than it would have been in reality.
Oh, yeah. It really adds to it if you have somebody who's kind of had a really easy 18 years going to Eton and having everything kind of handed to them, and they've gone to Eton, Harrow, one of these nice schools, and they've purchased a commission and they're commanding a bunch of men. The struggle is we're not on their side from a creative point of view. And you said about the Baker rifle. Well, some of the rifles officers did carry Bakers, but again, it is a bit of a mix. It wouldn't have been completely unusual. In a line regiment, no, pretty much unheard of. The only difference in a line regiment is in the skirmishing companies. the sergeants carried a musket rather than a spontoon, they're like halberd. But in the rifles, it did happen. There were certainly some accounts of it. But also the other side of it is some of the officers who were commanding companies, commanding the regiment within the rifles, are still mounted on horses. So you read some accounts from Waterloo, first-hand accounts, and the commanding officer's riding up and down on his horse, and actually his horse is hit and has its ear shot off and things like that, and he doesn't realise because he's so engrossed in the battle. So there is a bit of a divide there.
Okay, so back to the book, and we want to move forward eventually because we're trying to also cover the Battle of Talavera today, kind of kill two birds with one stone. But I do want to introduce an amazing character, one of my favourite characters in this book, and someone who does reoccur in Sharpe's regiment later on, another classic read, which is Lieutenant Colonel Simmerson, the man who's formed this regiment, the South Essex. I think it's his old militia regiment. He's now brought it to Spain. And this is the first time we meet him. It's a great conversation that really sets the tone between Simmerson and Sharpe as these sort of rivals. Here we go. Back to the book.
Lieutenant Sharpe, sir.
No, you're not. You're a damn disgrace.
Simmerson buckled his belt and turned back to Sharpe. Done much soldiering then, Sharpe, apart from fetching and carrying? A little, sir. Simmerson chuckled. How old are you? 32, sir. Sharpe stared rigidly ahead. 32, eh? And still only a lieutenant? What's the matter, Sharpe? Incompetence? Sharpe saw Forrest signalling to the colonel, but he ignored the movements. I joined in the ranks, sir. Forrest dropped his hand. The colonel dropped his mouth. There were not many men who made the jump from sergeant to ensign, and those who did could rarely be accused of incompetence. Simmerson snorted. Huh! You're not a gentleman then, Sharpe? No, sir. Well, you could try and dress like one, eh? Just because you grew up in a pigsty, that doesn't mean you have to dress like a pig. No, sir. There was nothing else for Sharpe to say. Simmerson's a brilliant character, isn't he? Do you think he was typical of commanding officers of the day, or a bit harsh there?
I'm going to say, luckily, probably not. He's a fantastic character and brilliantly played by Michael Cochrane in the TV series.
Yeah, that's what I see in my head every time.
Just fantastic. When he pops up in other TV programs, often playing a vicar, it really throws me. He's so good as Simmerson. I would say probably not as harsh as that. I can't say that all British officers were salt of the earth at all. The raising of regiments definitely happened. General Graham, Lord Lyndoch, he raises a battalion that's actually so successful, the Perthshire Volunteers. He has to raise a second one, and it almost bankrupts him.
Oh, this is the 90th, right? The 90th.
Yes, the 90th Regiment of Foot. And that's a personal war. He believed in the French Revolution, and during a passport investigation, they actually desecrate his wife's coffin, and he starts to hate the French. So that bit is also quite interesting, that he raises the regiment. That's quite true. But there are some darker, gruffer commanders, and two that really spring to mind is General Picton and Black Bob Crawford, commander of the Light Division. Black Bob Crawford was known for actually flogging his men. He was known for things like if he spotted men trying to walk around a puddle, marching them all then through a river to kind of teach them a lesson. But his men kind of almost respected him, that they knew the Black Bob was his dark mood, and they kind of almost respected him, but out of fear. Picton, again, even Wellington said he was a gruff, old, man. And he had a terrible reputation. He'd already been court-martialed for torturing a slave. And his reputation was completely down the pan. And it's really interesting when you see the debates today, because it's not new information. He lived with this during his time. But, as Wellington said, they needed men like him. Basically, warfare was not nice, and you had to keep these men in order. The last thing they wanted was looting, pillaging, and worse, which was infamous that the French army were doing this in Spain and Portugal. So the discipline and the whip were a tool that was sometimes used because they hadn't learned better. I won't say they were needed to use the whip, but they hadn't learned the better way of bringing the troops together. And it was also kind of a system of the class system, the purchasing system. The officers didn't often earn their commission, minority at the time. They were buying a commission, which was carried on because they kind of thought it's solidifying the British class system. and that the officers are always going to want to fight for Britain because they have literally an economic interest in their career. They're going to be spending more money than they're earning until they reach ranks of like colonel, and even then, there's all ways and means through the system. So they've got this vested interest in their own career. So it's a really strange time, and it did breed some very odd characters. Picton and Crawford, you wouldn't say they were nice men at all.
Yeah, so I guess Simmerson sort of has the worst of their traits mixed with incompetence.
Mixed with incompetence. Luckily, very luckily, there weren't many incompetent officers under Wellington. He didn't choose them. He got to write to Horse Guards, British Army headquarters, and say which brigade commanders he wanted. Regimental commanders had less choice over. People like Simmerson as lieutenant colonel. They've purchased or earned their way up. But they can be, moved around on paper. It's a link to Sharpe's regiment. You can hide people in the system and use them less, and that's something Wellington was very good at. He would only use the men who had talent, because he didn't like to delegate much responsibility. So if he gave that away, he's going to only give that to the most competent.
So I don't know if you want to take 2 minutes to we're just going to brush over it because it's not as important to the Battle of Talavera. But just to give us the background on what happens in the book here with the disastrous engagement at the bridge at Val della Casa, can you kind of sum that up in a few lines for the listeners who haven't read the book?
Yeah, Val della Casa was a fictional raid. Bernard Cornwell kind of writes Sharpe's unit as a bit of a forerunner to the SAS or the long-range desert groups, and sends them off on these long missions, which happened a lot less in the Peninsula, but it's damn good fun anyway. And they go off with the South Essex to kind of mentor them under the spy master of Major Hogan. I think it's Captain Hogan, the brilliant Brian Cox in the TV series. And with Simmerson's experience all being home service, when they are attacked and they're trying to blow up a bridge, half the force are over the bridge with Sharpe laying demolitions. And he kind of reinforces this attack. And as in the middle of Sharpe fighting, they are cut off because Simmerson orders the bridge to be blown up in the middle of the battle, leaving no route of escape. And in the books, I believe he throws the colours into the river, whereas in the TV series they are captured by a French patrol and carried away.
No, having just read the book, they're also captured in the book there as well. Or one of them is captured, and then Sharpe recaptures the other one himself.
That's it. And in the fighting of that, there's a famous bit where one of the more experienced officers, but he's a quiet, gentle soul within the South Essex Regiment, the fictional regiment that Simmerson comes from, is mortally wounded and lay there dying. This is Major Lennox, I seem to recall. Major Lennox, Scottish officer. And he comes with great experience. He's been with Wellington in campaign. Not quite sure why, but it's the dying officer's wish that he is given an Imperial Eagle onto his grave. And Sharpe doesn't promise this, but everyone hears Major Lennox ask it. And it really sets the scene for Sharpe's Eagle and what's going to come. Yeah, brilliant. No, it's a classic bit of fictional writing. And you're right. It's never really quite clear why Lennox, suddenly obsesses about this eagle as he's dying. But hey, what the hell? It makes for a great story. So we've got the eagle written in. Excellent. So I'm going to skip forward to one of your favourite bits of the book and the TV show, which is after the debacle at the bridge. Simmerson, of course, tries to blame the entire incident on Sharpe's legitimate refusal not to deploy his riflemen against the French cavalry. Skirmishers attacking cavalry generally doesn't end well. He makes this excuse to Sir Arthur Wellesley, and then the following scene ensues in the book. I don't know if you want to read it or if you'd like me to. I'll give it a go. Okay. Sharpe stared rigidly ahead at the picture on the wall behind the general. He heard a rustle of paper. Wellesley had picked up the sheet from the desk. His voice was lower. "You've lost, sir. As well as your colour, 242 men, either killed or injured. You lost a major, 3 captains, 5 lieutenants, 4 ensigns, and 10 sergeants. Are my figures correct?" Again, no one spoke. Wellesley stood up. Your orders, sir, were those of a fool. Next time, Sir Henry, I suggest you fly a white flag and save the French the trouble of unsheathing their swords.
Brilliant.
The job you had to do, sir, I could have been done by a company. I was forced by diplomacy to commit a battalion, and I sent yours, sir, so that your men would have a sight and taste of the French. I was wrong. As a result of one of your colours, is now on its way to Paris to be paraded in front of the mob. Tell me if I malign you. Simmerson had blanched white. Sharpe had never seen Wellesley so angry. He had seemed to have forgotten the presence of the others and had directed his words at Simmerson with a vengeful force. You no longer have a battalion, Sir Henry. It ceased to exist when you threw away your men and the colour. The South Essex is a single battalion, is that right? Simmerson nodded and muttered assent. You can hardly make up their numbers from home. I wish, Sir Henry, I could send you home, but I cannot. My hands are tied, sir, by Parliament, and by the Horse Guards, and by meddling politicians like your cousin. I'm declaring your battalion, Sir Henry, to be a battalion of detachments. I will attach new officers myself, and draft men into your ranks. You will serve in General Hill's division. But, sir, Simmerson was overwhelmed by the information. To be called a battalion of detachments, it was unthinkable. He stammered a protest. So the South Essex was wiped from the order of battle in disgrace, and Sharpe finds himself temporarily promoted in captain to be the commander of the light company, who begins to knock into shape.
So you're right there, that last bit. So Sharpe's sort of picked up and put into this command of the light company, and much against Simmerson's wishes there. But I think it is what a brilliant scene. I mean, that's probably my favourite scene of the whole book, actually.
It's one of my favourite scenes. They summarise the bit about the cousins in the TV series with Wellington, who goes on the defensive, and it's just when he says, Major Ennick should answer for his mistakes. And it's this Wellesley rage, which I well believed is the truth. And it's Major Lennox answer with his life, sir.
Major Lennox answer with his life, as you should have done if you had any sense of honour.
And this spouting of just his quick repartee that Wellington is known to be incredibly sharp mentally, but also have a really quick anger as well when his subordinates didn't have the information to hand or were arguing back. And so I can well believe that's in character within the fictional world. So I absolutely love that scene.
It is a classic. And for anyone watching, if you've read the book but haven't seen the TV episode, it's well worth a watch for exactly what Marcus is saying there. That sort of back and forth from Wellesley to Simmerson is brilliant, with everyone else just stood nervously on the side.
I'd strongly recommend the book and the TV episode, not one and the other, both.
So, interestingly, and I'm sure you knew this, Marcus, there actually was 2 battalions of detachments in the coming campaign, in the Talavera campaign. And one of them was in General Hill's division, and some of their exploits have kind of been written into the South Essex here, or the Battalion of Detachments as they're now known. So I thought that was quite interesting, where fact and fiction kind of merged there, which I thought was quite good. And in real life, of course, the Battalion of Detachments were just soldiers who'd been left behind during the march to Corunna, wasn't it? And had been left stationed in Portugal, or maybe their battalions had gone ahead and they were in hospital, that sort of thing.
That's right, yeah. In the first Battalion of Detachments I was reading, they were mostly light troops. There was a lot there from the 60th and the 95th, so the 2 rifle regiments. And they tried to have them in a rough companies where they were commanded by officers from their own regiment. So there were some similarities. And there were so many of them, they formed a second battalion, which then became quite a mixed match. And it was often termed as a mongrel regiment. They were so merged in. But they're never really written about because they don't have a regimental number. So there's not much history and tradition. But they pop up all over the place out of necessity of men just simply getting lost, left behind, especially with the retreat to Corunna. And so they do actually have this part where there's men from a regiment that should be back home in Britain, like the 95th actually, are there in the campaigns.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I know the Germans used to do it a lot in World War II. They'd just round up whoever they could find and throw them into sort of scratch battalions. I guess it's a similar sort of thing.
Yeah, and they did something else in the Peninsula and Napoleonic era a lot with the British, is they formed flank battalions, flank company battalions. So each regiment's got 10 companies, And you've got the two flanks, which would be the grenadiers, who are thought of being the tallest, the strongest, and kind of an elite, and the light company, who are thought of as being some of the smartest and best trained. Not necessarily, but that's roughly how it works. And then you've got 8 line companies in between. And when they were short of men or needing to do different things, they would, if they had a large force, they would just form the grenadiers as one regiment and the light companies another. But there were certainly cases where they'd taken like 4 or 5 light companies and 4 or 5 grenadier companies and formed them as a single regiment. And normally under the command of a major. They don't give it to a full lieutenant colonel. And these regiments pop up all over the place as well. I was reading about the battle around Cadiz, and there's the battalion of flank companies from Gibraltar. So, yeah, they do suddenly appear. And so there's regimental history and individual history, obviously county and families, that intertwine through battles where they almost like shouldn't be, inverted commas. Yeah. Yeah,
no, it's fascinating stuff. One thing now that in the book and also in the TV show they make a big thing of is Sharpe training his men for the upcoming Battle of Talavera by teaching them how to fire 3 rounds a minute, because that's what good soldiers do. They fire 3 rounds a minute. Now, he had to sort of, I'm not an expert on the weaponry. You'll know better than me, but sort of bite, spit, tap the weapon, was that realistic?
And what makes a good soldier, Sharpe?
The ability to fire 3 rounds a minute in any weather, sir.
3 a minute?
Short answer, no. Short answer, you're not going to be spitting a ball down a barrel. If you do anything after the first shot, it's going to be red hot. It's thumbed down, it's placed down. But there's always comes with a but. Not to say it didn't happen. And also, with the Baker rifle, the infantry pattern rifle as it was known then, versus the Brown Bess, which is unrifled, so it's smooth bore like a drain pipe on the inside. The Baker rifle bullet came in a patched and unpatched. So the patch was like a leather wrapping that was greased or oiled, and it had to be forced down really slowly. And this was the whole thing of like accuracy versus rate of fire. Riflemen really could only manage 2 rounds a minute. It was forcing it down. When they first brought out the infantry rifle, it actually came with a small mallet for the soldiers to force it down, but that was impractical. They threw that away. So they were like breaking their hands open, forcing this down. Whereas the Brown Bess, you could just get it down there, bit of paper after it, ram it once. Right, let's do the loading. But it wasn't completely uncommon to think that actually they were sometimes issued, they would have a little pouch on their hip with it ready to load, but they'd have a patch separately to the ball, and they meant to load it in. Because to save time, they would discard the patch and just load that in. You're talking very close range. We just need to get one in. We're going to save ourselves 10, 20 seconds by just kind of quickly, and it's going to now be really inaccurate. It's going to be like a musket. But at close range, fighting in streets, buildings, someone's coming at you, it's better to have something than nothing. So that kind of spitting down the thing, I think, kind of comes from unpatching a ball in rifles and getting it out really quickly, of soldiers' necessity and desperation. But no, there's quite a lot of debate, especially within reenactment, where putting your face over a half-loaded weapon and spitting a musket ball down there, as you can imagine, is really quite an unsafe
bloody
thing to do.
Health and safety gone mad.
Health and safety, nightmare. Can you imagine Sharpe with a pair of safety goggles and a high-vis jacket? It just wouldn't go.
Oh, brilliant. Well, so let's carry on then. So battle is approaching. We're approaching the huge Battle of Talavera. And as anyone who heard the last few episodes will know, Wellesley had retaken Oporto and kicked Marshal Soult from northern Portugal. He'd now turned his army east and marched into Spain to join forces with a Spanish army under General Cuesta, ready to attack Marshal Victor's corps of just over 20,000 men. Now, early on the morning of the 23rd of July, Wellesley was ready to attack. He had the agreement of Cuesta that they were going to really smash into Victor's army, which at that point had no other supporting units around it. You know, they hadn't met up with Sebastiani's corps and King Joseph. So anyway, with the French greatly outnumbered, the British and Spanish mustering around 50,000 men, brilliant victory is assured. I'll now let Bernard Cornwell and Sharpe describe what happens next. Sharpe made his way towards Forest to find out what he had missed when he saw a familiar figure riding hard down the track. He walked into the road and held up a hand. It was Lieutenant Colonel Lawford, and he was furious. He saw Sharpe, reined in and swore, "Bloody hell, Richard, bloody hell, bloody Spanish. What's happened?" Lawford could barely contain his anger. "The bloody Spanish refused to wake up, can you believe it?" Other officers drew around. Lawford took off his hat and wiped his forehead. He had deep circles under his eyes. "We get up at 2 o'clock in the bloody morning to save their bloody country, and they can't be bothered to get out of bed." Lawford looked around as though hoping to see a Spaniard on whom to vent his seething fury. "We rode over there at 6. Quester's in his bloody coach lying on bloody cushions and says his army is too tired to fight. Can you believe it? We had them, like that." He pinched a finger and thumb together. "We would have murdered them this morning." So, Marcus, is that exactly what happened from what you're aware?
It's pretty close, actually. The relationship between the soon-to-be Wellington, Wellesley, and the Spanish was really difficult. It would have been much better with the Portuguese. That was a really good relationship. He had approval from the Supreme Junta in Porto and to command the Spanish troops, and they'd been integrated into the British Army very successfully. Spain, not so much so. They were very high and mighty about the command of their army, and they had actually fought some brief victories against the French. And they really also had their own personal dislike of the French because they'd been stabbed in the back by Napoleon, which many people forget that he was meant to be the ally of the King of Spain. He fought, at Trafalgar, the Spanish and the French, and then literally kidnapped the King of Spain and held his family to ransom and started murdering in the streets of Madrid. So there's a lot of hatred and sudden distrust. But not very long ago, they were fighting the British at Trafalgar. So they didn't quite trust the British yet either. So what had actually kind of happened is they'd agreed that much like in Portugal, and the Portuguese did it really successfully, that the Spanish were going to supply wagons, logistics, guides, and also supplies of food. And it just doesn't materialise. So from the offset, Wellesley has got a really difficult relationship in butting heads with the Spanish commanders and going, "Where are my supplies? We've got the troops here, but we can't move. We haven't got anything." And then, yes, at Talavera, the two forces meet in July. 3 days later, they get this perfect opportunity to attack Marshal Victor, who's not yet met up with Joseph Bonaparte and the other French forces. And Suester just refuses point blank to move. It's not the day for him. He doesn't want to. I don't want to steer into any stereotypes. So they basically do refuse to move, and they don't want to kind of go under the British command. And then the next day, Suester sees the French and wants to go. Wellesley realises that the trap's too late, doesn't want to go. The French reinforcements are too near. He implores Suester not to do it, because he says, "We're not going to go, it's basically a trap." Suester moves off, and the day following that, he's badly mauled in a battle and has to retreat back to Wellesley's British forces, admitting that was a mistake. Well, I'm not sure he actually does admit it. He just kind of badly gets loads of his troops killed, even though he was told it was going to happen.
And I believe he then turned around on the east of the Alberche River to want to fight the advancing French, who now outnumbered him. And Wellesley had to go over and literally bend his knee and beg Quester or Suester, as I'm not sure which is the correct pronunciation, to go back across the Alberche River to this position that Wellesley had decided would be much better to fight the battle outside the town of Talavera, in a sort of line running from the Tagus River up to the Cerro de Medellin, the big hill that overlooked the plain below. And that's kind of where the battle was then fought. Yeah, and I mean, by this point, though, the numbers were quite similar, weren't they? It was very much a sort of 50-50 battle.
Now the numbers are similar. They've lost their advantage. They've lost kind of any sort of element of surprise. What they do have is they've got this really strong position. Something that you've always got to give Wellington credit for, even people who dislike Wellington, is he's got a good eye for ground. He knows where he can hide troops, where he can maneuver troops, where he'll have an advantage, even if it's only slight. And that slight advantage being the real difference in battles. And it very rarely lets him down. I'm thinking of Fuentes de Unero being one of the few cases it really lets him down. But picking the rises in this difficult terrain across the Iberian Peninsula, he really comes into his own. He's learned it for 9 years in India. He's learned logistics and he's learned reading terrain brilliantly. And he does it with really good effect here at Talavera of picking a really strong position.
Yeah, so then Sharpe, the battle is coming. Sharpe's made this pledge, this promise to the dying Major Lennox to capture an eagle. Now there's a few lines in the book on this, so I'll just quote from the book, and then I might ask you to give us a bit more background on eagles, on the French eagle, because a lot of people who don't follow the Napoleonic Wars as closely as us may not know what that is. So back to the book. In the last 6 years, the French had appeared on the battlefield with new standards. In place of the old colours, they now carried gilded eagles mounted on poles. It was said that each eagle was personally presented to the regiment by the Emperor himself, and the standards were therefore more than just a symbol of the regiment, they were a symbol of all France's pride in their new order. To take an eagle was to make Bonaparte wince in person. Sharpe felt the anger rise in him. I don't mind replacing Simmerson's flag with an eagle, but I'm bloody angry that I have to carve my way through a company of French grenadiers just to stay in the army. Just to backtrack a bit, this is because Simmerson had sent a report to London blaming everything on Sharpe, and he thought he was going to either get kicked out the army or sent to a regiment in the West Indies, an inevitable death from yellow fever. Anyway, Lawford said nothing. He knew that Sharpe spoke the truth. The only thing that could stop the officials in Whitehall singling out Sharpe for punishment was if the rifleman performed a deed of such undoubted merit that they would look foolish to make him a scapegoat. Privately, Lawford thought Sharpe had done more than enough. He had regained a colour, captured a gun, but the account of his deeds would be muddied in London by Simmerson's telling. No, he had to do more, go further, risking his life in an attempt to keep his job. Whew. So, I mean, I think that sums it up, but does that capture the importance of eagles? Like, what did that mean to the French?
I mean, it meant everything to the French, and capturing meant everything to the British, and vice versa. British colours being captured was a huge honour to the French. The eagle themselves, would say, in theory, they were touched by Napoleon's own hand. Each regiment has colours, flags. And in the French army at the time, the 1st battalion, of which you have multiple battalions, carried the eagles, and the others carried a normal standard. So they were meant to represent the elite of their regiments, being carried at the front, touched by their emperor. And so it's carrying all of these men's hopes, ambitions, glory of past honour, and representing everything of Napoleon and the French Empire. So all encapsulated within one flag. And it would be silk with a golden eagle at the top, and on it would have their battle honours, much like British colours. The British carried two, a regimental colour and a king's colour, and we had two carried by an ensign. And they were always held in the middle of a regiment. So to get towards one, you've got to, in theory, get to the thickest fighting. And they're always going to be guarded really, really religiously. There are so many depictions within the British Army of people giving literally life and limb, people who have actually lost arms fighting for these. And in later wars, like the Anglo-Afghan conflict, people wrapping the flag around themselves and being shot and killed with it so that they're buried with it rather than losing it to Afghan tribesmen.
Like Flashman.
And also it does have... Sorry?
Like Flashman in the first Flashman book.
Yeah, he witnesses this famous scene of a retreat.
Yeah.
And much like Sharpe, he's written into fantastic novels.
That's one for another series. We can discuss Flashman in another series, I think.
He's a rogue and a cad. I love Flashman too. But yeah, and it also has got this sense of glory. So capturing one did actually often lead to promotion. I'm famously thinking of Sergeant Ewart at Waterloo. He captures an eagle, probably captures the eagle. There's still a bit of controversy raging, and he's promoted to an ensign, so a second lieutenant in the cavalry. And he's very famous because there's a pub named after him in the Royal Mile of Edinburgh that lots of people visit. So his name lives on in a pub, which is quite right too. And it's one of the few ways you can get automatic promotion up from the ranks. Capturing an eagle or an enemy colours. The guns, which are colours, not so much, but they'll give you certain prize money. Or a storming into the breach. Places like Bad Hof and Ciudad Rodrigo. If you're in the forlorn hope, which are almost guaranteed to die, I believe the officer leading it would get an automatic promotion from lieutenant to captain, and the sergeant would get a commission into a second lieutenant or ensign. So it's acts of bravery which are near suicidal would give this sudden promotions. And also glory, they were always presented back to either the king or the Prince Regent. After Waterloo, they are laying, the two eagles from Waterloo, are laying at the Prince Regent's feet, interrupting a huge ball he's having. And he's given them by Major Percy, and the whole story of Waterloo unfolds. So they're being brought back and displayed around London and in all sorts of important places. So they are a huge symbol of fighting the enemy, British resistance of a small army versus this big imperial. The French Empire by this time is huge. It's going from Portugal to the east of Europe, Poland, and everything much in between in one way or another is being subjugated by the Bonapartist family. So kind of it's a symbol of British resistance. What we'd have in World War I, World War II as a bulldog, they have then as Britannia or John Bull, a little farmer figure, against a massive empire, and capturing one of their sacred eagles. Napoleon's built a cult around himself similar to Caesar, this Roman symbology of eagles, and they even have lightning bolts in their claws or wreaths around their necks like a laurel wreath in certain cases. So yeah, an eagle is a big deal.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, let's not give away whether Sharpe is successful. I think we all know he is. Oh, whoops, did I let that go? But so I want to move forward to the night of the 27th of July, because this is covered in Sharpe's Eagle, and it's actually a very important part of the battle, or actually isn't really, but is a good bit of drama. So for the listeners who aren't aware, the 27th, there's a day of skirmishing and fighting as the Spanish withdraw, and two of the British divisions, including, I think it's Sherbrooke's, I may be wrong there, I'll have to check my notes. But anyway, they go and support the Spanish to help them withdraw. And as the British come back to their assigned positions on the battlefield, there's a miscommunication. And the peak of the hill, the peak of Medellin, which is this large feature that dominates the battlefield, is meant to be manned by Hill's division, except in the darkness and in the confusion with everybody tired, everybody kind of settles down for the night in the wrong place. And no pickets are put out in the right place because everybody thinks they're the second line, and everyone is under the illusion that there's another line of troops in front of them. So Marshal Victor sees his opportunity that evening. He can see that the hill isn't as well defended as he might have hoped, and he sends 3 regiments, including the 9th Legere, who play a big part in this battle actually, to take the hill. So let's have a look, because Sharpe finds himself in the middle of that. So back to the book and the night attack, which luckily our man Captain Sharpe at this point manages to spot the attack when no one else does. So here we go. Sharpe turned around and stared at the far horizon and the red glow of the French fires that lined the edge of the hill with a faint light. There were rabbits moving on the crest of the hill he had climbed. He could see their small shapes bobbing, and suddenly he froze. Had there been sentries there he had missed? They were not rabbits. He could see the silhouettes of men. He had mistaken their heads for rabbits, but as they climbed over the crest he could see a dozen men carrying guns heading towards him. He lay flat on the grass, gripping the sword, and stared at the dim glow of the skyline. He put his ear to the ground and heard what he feared to hear, the faint thump of marching feet. And he raised his head and kept looking as the dozen men turned into a misshapen mass. He remembered telling Hogan that the French would not attack at night. Yet he was seeing just that, a night attack on the Medellin. The dozen men would be some of the skirmishers, the French voltiers or tirailleurs, I always get those two words mixed up. And the solid mass was a French column climbing the hill in silence. But how to be sure? It could as easily be a British battalion moving in the dark, finding a new place to camp. But this late at night? He wriggled forward on knees and elbows, keeping his body close to the earth, so that whoever was coming in the dark would not see him silhouetted in the fires. The sword rustled on the grass. He seemed to be making a deafening sound, but the men walked on towards him. So I think we'll jump forward there. Basically, luckily our man Sharpe is able to thwart that attack and force the French to fire a volley towards him. But is that what happened? I mean, is that pretty close to the truth there?
Yeah, the night attack's a really strange one. Victor's force goes, a small force goes forwards without seeming to have much permission and support. It leaves a huge amount of confusion because it seems that the British brigade commander has got confused and thinks he's in the second line, not the front line. And even though I believe standing orders would have always had to put out sentries, they're so exhausted from the day's marching and the heat. I remember this is in late July in Spain on a dusty plain and marching up a hill. And it's a huge oversight for the officers, actually, who are responsible for that. But junior officers, actually, they basically drop themselves down and they kind of sleep where they fall down on their packs. And it's really quite a close run thing. And General Hill, Daddy Hill to his men, a man I've got quite a lot of respect for, he rides forwards and kind of personally manages the battle. In fact, he rides so far forwards, the French tirailleurs, who are the skirmishers, actually grab him and try to pull him off his horse. And he's able to literally beat them off, fight them off, and then turn tail and run. But the man riding next to him, the brigade major, is shot and killed during that. So he's really close to losing General Hill, who's often Wellington's second in command. So it would have changed quite a lot of history. It would have changed the course of several battles to lose Hill. But it was a huge oversight to not have that. And it's a big mistake. But it's just about abled. And obviously Bernard Cornwell writes in that Sharpe starts a volley early. I'm not so sure that they did actually give away the position. They cause a huge amount of confusion within the British. So I think they really do get in amongst British regiments.
I think the 7th Line Battalion of the King's German Legion was almost wiped out. I mean, I think about half their number were either killed or captured.
Yeah, I think there was about 400 killed and wounded both sides. So that's like a good size of a regiment, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? I don't think it's possible to do justice these days to how confusing a night engagement must have been in those days. It
must be bad when you're relying upon mass formations, volley fire, and working as a body of men rather than individuals, unless you're skirmishers. You're not giving that independent thought. So you're going to be stood there waiting for orders, waiting for everyone to form up next to you. But all I can say is if get a group together of about 8 friends and go for a walk across a field and into a woods and into another field, try to take a right and a left, and you'll just see everyone will get lost so quickly in the dead of night without a moon out. And then suddenly add a couple of thousand people coming at you, trying to kill you. The confusion would be huge. Yeah. Absolutely massive.
Yeah, exactly. But luckily, somehow, I think Sir Arthur Wellesley rides across and General Hill is on the scene, and they're able to reorganise to organise a counter-attack. And I think the 29th... Yeah,
Hill does really well with that. Somebody to really give credit to. He's another man. His men. He's the reverse of your Pictons and your Crawfords and your Simmersons. He's known as Daddy Hill because he's so beloved by his men. They really like him, his division's troops.
And I was reading just yesterday how he very rarely swore. It was only heard to swear on 2 occasions, and one of them was on the 28th of July, which maybe we can talk about in a bit. But yeah. So
it
anyway,
seems like a really nice man when you start reading about him.
Well, even the pictures of him, like he just looks like your sweet old uncle.
Yes, yeah, he really does.
So anyway, the French did take the summit of Medellin for a few minutes, but eventually were pushed off with a counterattack led by the 29th Regiment of Foot, who actually did sterling work in pushing the 9th Légère back off the hill and sending them reeling down it. The 1st Battalion of Detachments were there, although Charles Leslie of the 29th remembers them sort of being all confused and not knowing what to do and saying to the officers of the 29th, we're willing to fight, we just need somebody to lead us, which I think is quite telling actually about the state of morale in that unit at that point. So after the night attack, the Battalion of Detachments and the 29th and I think the Buffs, they sort of manned their positions on the hill, but there was no rest for them. At 5 in the morning, a single artillery piece opened fire. It was the signal for the battle to begin. The French had decided to try and again retake the Medellin. Huge columns were arrayed, mainly against the British left flank around the Medellin, and they began to move forward. Do you want to describe the scene from the book there?
Yeah, Bernard Cornwell takes it up. Ensign Denny came and knelt beside Sharpe. His face betrayed the worry and fear that the drumming, chanting, mass endangered. Sharpe looked at him. What do you think? Sir? Frightening? Denny nodded. Sharpe laughed. Did you ever learn mathematics? Yes, sir. So add up, how many Frenchmen can actually use their muskets? Then he stared at the column and Sharpe saw realization draw on his face. The French column was a tried and tested battle winner, but against good troops it was a death trap. Only the front rank and the two flank files could actually use their guns, and the hundreds of men in the nearest column, only the 60 in the front rank and the men on the ends of the 30 or so other ranks could actually fire their enemies. The massive men in the middle were there merely to add weight, to look impressive, cheer, and fill up the gaps left by the dead.
Now, I know you can fire 3 rounds a minute. But what I want to know now is, can you stand?
So picking up, Marcus, I think that's spot on, isn't it? That's pretty much the mathematics behind why line beat column every time. Is that fair to say?
It is, but it's really strange when it comes to the column does work. We keep, like, you see it time and time again. The British beating the column. But you've got to remember that by this point, by 1809, the French army in France had conquered nearly all of Europe by using the column. And so it seems like it's nonsensical, but it does have logic. Largely because Napoleon's army is made up of conscripts, and it's got the resource of manpower. And so what they're trying to do is force men forwards in an organised mass attack. And they use spirits, they call it the French élan, the cheering, the chanting, to drive their attack home. And it's, I mean, they're really good at it. They do beat, Austrian, Russian, Spanish armies by using these tactics. Where it slightly starts to fall short is it's meant to, as the column approaches the line, the men in the line see a huge mass, like an unstoppable mass of men coming towards them. It's slightly misleading with the column because it actually is slightly wider than it is deep, but it's going to be supported by another regiment and another regiment and another regiment. So it's actually a series of wide, dense units. And the units facing them are meant to worry, panic, hesitate, and fall back. But it's something the British don't do. The French said of British, they don't know when they're beaten. And they carry on fighting, they carry on firing. And that's when the mathematics come in, but also training. And the British Army at the time is one of the few in Europe who's going to be training with live ammunition. So that biting of the cartridge, they still bite the end of it to pour the powder down. And going through the motions, they are really well drilled in. And they're also, it's almost like a pig-headed stubbornness of the British of not wanting to fall back. And it's something they go into a whole study of regimental honour, comradeship. They build up really strongly on a subunit level that you're looking after the men next to you. And then you build that into a whole regimental pride, regimental history. And they don't want to fall back. They don't want to let their mates down. They don't want to let their regiment down. They don't want to be seen as to be the one who steps back. And that simple kind of spirit of these British soldiers, never mind our Portuguese and German allies within the army, actually. It's quite a wide nation. But they don't step back, and they carry on pouring in these volleys. And they also do something they practice called Platoon Fire, which is like a ripple fire effect, where it's just half a company will be firing down the line. So to your ear, it will sound almost like somewhere between tap dance and machine gun fire. And by the time it's reached one end, the guys at the other end have reloaded, and it's constant. And at really close range, the range of a musket is only like 80 yards, like 60 meters. If they can get that constant fire, there's not a pause, then they can be really deadly. If there's a pause, they'll have one volley, and then the French are going to carry on sweeping in. So it's a mixture of mutual regiment supports, the British stubbornness, and training, all mixed in, and mathematics take over. And it's a really deadly mathematics, and it causes large French casualties. It does almost work a few times. The French at the Battle of Bukassa, they get on top of a ridge where the British are defending, and they keep coming in, and they keep coming in. They're supported. They've got huge columns, but the British have got to fold round, and they do. They step back, allowing more regiments to come in, and more maths is kind of added in, more weight of fire, and it does work. The British lines are not broken by French columns.
Brilliant. And on this occasion also, the attack by the French right wing against the British left is once again repulsed. And the poor 9th Leger, who took a battering at the Battle of Talavera, once again sent reeling back across the Portinha brook that kind of separated the two armies along much of the battlefield there. And I mean, Bernard Cornwell touches on it. There's then a kind of sort of unofficial armistice between the armies, isn't there, at Talavera, while the French High Command sort of go off and decide what to do, because they're kind of not quite sure now. They're finally combined all their armies. And funnily enough, I was just reading about it, which is why I'm fairly confident talking about it. At this point, Jourdan and King Joseph and Sebastiani are all for just holding the defensive. They say, you know what, let's just stay where we are. We're still waiting for Soult's army. Once he gets here, we can just smash these guys, but let's just hold where we are. So there's this big debate happening in the background. At which point then they get a couple of runners arrive, one to tell them Soult's corps is still miles away and won't be there anytime soon for a few days, and another to say, General, I think Venegas, the Spanish commander, is now threatening Madrid and they're going to have to pull off probably 15,000 men to go and fight this guy. So right, the decision is made, let's go crush. We're going to have to just launch this massive attack to crush the British today and then rush back to Madrid to go fight Venegas and his army of... might be La Mancha, I can't quite remember. Perhaps, I don't know, the Spanish army isn't my speciality, probably the same as you.
Not my strong point, I'm afraid, either. They've all given like localized names as opposed to numbers, so it makes it slightly harder for my Anglo-Saxon tongue. Exactly.
So anyway, moving back to the book, and at around 2 p.m, another huge attack was launched against the British. Again, it was repulsed by heavy volley fire, but then the battle came close to unravelling when the British follow-up bayonet charge, as was often the case, went too far. Let's go back to the book and the words of Bernard Cornwell. The general officers watched as the first line of the French attack disintegrated and the line of Germans and guardsmen chased them backwards, pursuing the shattered columns at bayonet point across the stream, past the horse artillery which had simply been abandoned by the enemy without firing a shot. Oh God! Sharpe groaned in disbelief. What? Knowles looked towards the stream, behind the backs of the Dutch battalion who were marooned in the middle of the field, to where the victorious Germans were now in trouble. The first French columns had fled, broken and defeated, but at the stream was a second line of columns as large as the first, and the shattered Frenchmen found shelter behind the waiting guns of their reserve. The German and British troops, their blood roused, bayonets wet, but muskets unloaded, ran straight into the fire of the reserve French troops, and it was the turn of the British to be shattered by musket volleys. They turned and fled in total disorder, and behind them the second line of columns, reinforced with the survivors of the first, struck up the drumbeats and started to march into the plain. Now, this was the main crisis of the battle, and tell me, this was quite common, wasn't it? Some colonels did struggle to control their regiments once their blood was up.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's literally that. The bayonets go on, and even today, the bayonet is a psychological symbol of an attack. And they go and they see the enemy running, and they see victory in a microscope, and they've got their blinkers on, and they think, that's it, the entire French army is running, and they charge after them. And unfortunately, they overexpose. They're leaving the men who aren't fighting are just going to be stood there waiting for orders, shocked and surprised that another regiment is running forwards and waiting. They're going to be overexposed, they're flanked, and then also if they're running, really hard to run in a line, really difficult. Different terrain, different fitness, different lengths of legs, it all comes into play, and they're going to be scattered over a wide area. They've lost that line, they've lost that cohesion, and as you said there, you know, the French have got their columns, they've got numbers, and it's densely packed, so it doesn't really matter if they're you've got one or two columns coming at them. It's a scattered formation, and they've got the spirit now because they're seeing a unit that doesn't have the cohesion to defend itself, and they can push in. It happens quite frequently. It's really hard to control the men. I think they've got the mixture of wanting to win, but there is a other side to it that's not often written about. If you get an enemy dead on the floor, you've got whatever's in his pack, and you know that he's got his pay, and we know the French, he's probably got some loot in there as well, and that loot is now fair game because you didn't steal it from a Spaniard, you stole it from a Frenchman. So there's a chance to make yourself temporarily rich.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And you're right, that isn't often as discussed as maybe it could or should be, because, yeah, I guess a lot of soldiers look forward to battles for exactly that.
There was a chance to make money in life. Life was short and dangerous anyway, so do what you can to try to get by effectively.
Exactly. So I want to jump forward a little now to Sharpe's capture of a French eagle. As we talked about, he'd made this promise, and now he was hoping to restore the honour of the South Essex by capturing one. So after this sort of nearly disastrous counterattack by the Guards, the line stabilised and the main French assault had been repulsed. But then in the book, in Sharpe's Eagle, this white-coated Dutch battalion is left stranded. Now, as it happens, I don't think that regiment was actually in that position during the battle. But Sharpe and Sergeant Harper and the others from the Light Company see their chance and make a rush for the unit's Eagle. A brutal hand-to-hand fight ensued. So let me just take a moment to read from the book to get a bit of a sense of the fight that ensued. The standard bearer jumped out of the ranks to carry the precious Eagle down the battalion to safety, but there was a crack, the man fell, and Sharpe heard Hagman's customary, "Got him." Then there was a new sound, more volleys, and the Dutch battalion shook like a wounded animal as the South Essex arrived on their flank and began to pour in their volleys. Sharpe was faced by a crazed officer who swung at him with a sword, missed, and screamed in panic as Sharpe lunged with the point. A man in white ran out of the ranks to pick up the fallen Eagle, but Sharpe was through the line as well, and he kicked the man in the ribs, bent and plucked the staff from the ground. There was a formless scream from the enemy. Men lunged at him with bayonets, and he felt a blow on the thigh. But Harper was there with the axe. I mean, why wouldn't you carry an axe into battle? And so was Denny with his ridiculously slim sword. And so the Eagle was taken, and jubilantly Sharpe and Sergeant Harper returned to their battalion lines to find that Lieutenant Colonel Simmerson had been relieved of his command. And I'm just going to go back to the book one last time before we discuss this whole thing, because I think this is great. So back to Bernard Cornwell. The trophy was low at his side, hidden in the press of men, but he dragged it clear so that the gilded statuette suddenly flashed in the light. He handed it up to Lawford. "The battalion's missing colour, sir. It was the best Sergeant Harper and I could do." Lawford stared at the two men, at the tiredness beneath the powder stains, at the lines on their faces grooved with blood from scalp wounds, and at the black patches where bayonets had sprung blood into their green jackets. He took the Eagle, disbelieving, knowing it was the one thing that would restore the battalion's pride, and hoisted it high into the air. Oh, I'm getting goosebumps reading it. The South Essex, so long scorned by the army, saw it and cheered, slapped each other's backs, hoisted their muskets triumphantly into the air, cheered until other battalions stopped to see what the noise was about. Above them on the Medellin, General Hill heard the excitement and trained a telescope on the battalion that had so nearly lost the battle. He caught the Eagle in the lens and his mouth dropped open. "I'll be damned, bless my soul, the strangest thing. The South Essex have captured an Eagle." There was a dry laugh beside him, and Hill turned to see Sir Arthur Wellesley. "Sir, I'll be damned too, Hill. That's only the third time I've ever heard you swear." Oh, we mentioned that earlier. He took the glass from Hill and looked down the slope. "God damn it, you're right. Let's go and see this strange bird." So, Sharpe and Harper, they did the thing. What do you make of all of that? Realistic? Did it happen? Did an eagle get captured at Talavera?
No eagle at Talavera, unfortunately. Eagles captured in the Peninsular War. We've got to wait quite a while, though. We've got to wait till 1811 for an eagle to be captured in the Peninsular War. And that's all the way down the south at the Battle of Barossa. Not even with Wellington. It's with General Graham, who I was talking about earlier, who raised his own battalion. And one of his regiments down there, the 87th, the Prince of Wales Irish Regiment, fight into the middle of a column, hand-to-hand fighting, and lieutenant and a sergeant. And I think the lieutenant's killed in capturing it, and the sergeant kind of rushes in and grabs it. And this is Sergeant Patrick Masterman of the 87th Regiment. And he apparently holds it up, and it's hard not to do it with a slight Irish accent, so I apologise, because he says, "Bejeebus, boys, I've got the cuckoo." I can't say bejeebus without a slight Irish accent, but apparently that is what he said.
Brilliant.
He said, "Bejeebus, I've got the cuckoo."
Possibly the greatest quote in military history.
You just don't get that in history of motorsports, for example, or food history. No, it's got to be the Peninsular War to have "Bejeebus, boy, I've got the cuckoo." And there's not much written about what happened to Patrick Masterman. He's certainly quite famous. The standard goes back to Britain, is presented, and it's displayed in the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, which is now famous for the Chelsea pensioners. and it's actually stolen in 1852, the same year the Duke of Wellington dies. Somebody breaks in through the ceiling, steals it, because they either were solid gold or they were gilded wood to paint it, and people thought they were solid gold anyway. So someone stole it, and they instantly have a replica made up. So the regiment doesn't miss it out. But yeah, we've got to wait a while. There's then in the rest of the Peninsula War quite a few more eagles. For example, at Salamanca, despite huge cavalry charges which smash through loads and loads of regimental commands, the cavalry kind of go on and don't capture any eagles, and 2 foot regiments, one of which is the 44th East Essex, which the South Essex Regiment is very closely based on. They capture an eagle at Salamanca, and then the famous 2 at Waterloo as well. So as you tell your story of both the Peninsular War and also if you're reading Sharpe, the eagles definitely do start to crop up. And many of them are back on display in British museums today.
Brilliant. And one last question. Do we know, did the original ever turn up after it got stolen? Did you ever come across that in your research?
No, never found it. There's some strange things in history that get stolen and just don't reappear. It's almost, I sometimes think that they're either too hot to handle, or a combination that if they can be broken and broken up for parts, for scrap, especially gold, it will make it easier to sell on. So there's other items I can think of in history. One of the Duke of Wellington's batons was stolen in the 1950s because it had diamonds in it, and it's never been recovered and probably never will be, because sell the diamonds individually rather than trying to sell an item that would be too recognisable. So unfortunately, that eagle is probably lost. We never know. When Duke of Wellington's portrait was stolen from the National Portrait Gallery, it was found in a hedgerow, and I'm thinking of the 1966 World Cup as well. The Duke of Wellington's portrait has got its own wonderful story. It's the one by Goya. I was in the National Portrait Gallery, and it was snuck out the gents' toilet window in the time before security cameras. And it disappeared for a couple of years. And if you watch Dr. No, the original James Bond, as he walks through Dr. No's lair, there's a painting of the Duke of Wellington. Because who would have a priceless art that's been stolen of the Duke of Wellington? A Bond villain, no one else.
Perfect, love it. Well, before we wrap up, we should probably just finish our short narrative of the Battle of Talavera. We've kind of covered Sharpe's role in it. But I mean, British victory, but did it lead to any long-term success? And what did it mean for Wellesley?
It's a difficult one. Actually, Battle of Talavera wasn't one that was as widely celebrated in Britain, because the casualty rate was really high. The French had lost about 7,200 men, the British 5,300, and many of those casualties and died. So it was really difficult. However, for the Duke of Wellington connection, which is kind of my angle on history, it grants him his titles. He's then given Viscount Wellington, which he chooses because of the similarity in the surname. He's advised that on his brother, and he's also given a title of Talavera, which is often quite common to give 2 titles. But he chooses Wellington because it's similar to Wellesley, so it's easy to remember, make him famous, basically. And it really starts to bring his name from Sir Arthur Wellesley to Lord Wellington, Viscount. It brings the start of that story of the Duke of Wellington, and he actually literally works his way up the ranks now from Lord to now to Viscount, and all the way up through the British aristocracy to Duke. And something I quite love is, though after different battles he's promoted, he doesn't get the letters patent, giving him them because they are held in the House of Lords. So it's not until he returns to Britain in 1815 as he gets all of his letters at once. It's like receiving all of your promotions, all of your Christmas bonuses in a single day for the last about 7 years. And it really starts to build his name as it's one of the biggest, Talavera is one of the biggest set battles. After, there's Vimero, which ended with the Treaty of Sintra, and there's some disgrace there. And Talavera now starts to set the scene from 1809 all the way through to 1814, and the next 5 years of continuous fighting.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it for today. Thank you. So there we have it, guys. I must say I really enjoyed that interview. More of a conversation really, and I hope to follow this format for 1 or 2 future episodes. Let me know if you liked it. Talavera was a brutal battle, but despite the casualties, it was a British and Spanish victory. A close one, mind, more like scraping through on away goals rather than a decisive one-sided pummelling. The French, unable to break the Allied line, were forced to withdraw, much to the relief of the exhausted Redcoats. But there was to be no glorious advance on Madrid for the British. Instead, another French army under Soult was soon threatening their rear. And, lacking supplies and with little support from their Spanish allies, Wellington, as we'll now refer to him, was forced to withdraw westward, back to the Portuguese border. It was a hard pill to swallow. But in the grand scheme of things and with the benefit of hindsight, probably the right thing to do. In the next episode, I'm hoping to examine the next big battle of the war at Busaco, where another large French army will attempt to invade Portugal once more. We'll meet the new and improved Portuguese army as they answer the all-important question, will they stand? It's another great tale, and it's well worth subscribing to make sure you don't miss it. If you're watching this on YouTube, remember you can hear the audio-only version on your podcasting app, and vice versa. If you're listening to it and you want to watch the video, you can just search on YouTube for Redcoat History. Until then, ladies and gents, I wish you a Merry Christmas. Don't drink too much rum, and please try and refrain from plundering the locals. Have a good one.